talking about imposter syndrome today because speaking to such a large group of talented and wonderful people, I'm definitely feeling it a little bit today. But hopefully I'll give you some good things to take back home. I'm talking about the WordPress REST API today and some unusual applications that we've seen over the past couple of years at Boston University for it. But before I get into that, I want to give you a little context about what WordPress is like at Boston University. So we use WordPress very heavily at Boston University. There's over 2,700 WordPress sites and counting. I pulled these stats a little while ago, so more are being added every day. 188 plus WordPress child themes, one great big old multi-network, multi-site installation, and one great big old framework. And that part's me. I take care of the responsive framework, and I sort of oversee it and make sure that it works well for our end users, both people at the university who don't come through marketing and communications for a custom theme, as well as our theme development team, both designers and developers, making sure that we address their needs as well. And when I learned about the REST API a couple of years ago, what it meant to me was largely informed by blogs, Twitter, and a lot of other developers speaking. And you might have noticed by my title, I'm not a developer. So when you all told me that we could redo the WordPress admin or, rewrite sites in React or, go to headless CMS, they all sounded really, really neat to me. But they didn't sound like something that I could realistically do as someone who was watching over a couple thousand sites and a couple hundred WordPress child themes. In fact, I gotta admit, I wasn't too excited about it. But I wouldn't be talking here today if I didn't get past that. It took me a while to see how the WordPress REST API could help me, especially coming from a design perspective and someone who works on a framework as well as occasional design work and UX work. So my story today is about two projects that helped me realize and come to the conclusion that the REST API can help me. So the first project that I worked on that really introduced me to the REST API was this editorial design. It was this article for our alumni magazine, Bostonia. And it's about Dr. Onahe Woodbine. He's an alum who grew up in Roxbury, which is a suburb within Boston. And his experience in Roxbury growing up was very informed by basketball. He played a lot of basketball, and his peers did as well. And they did this to sort of help understand and address really big life questions about living in inner city Boston. Why is there poverty around me? Why did my friend die in a car crash? Really big, honest life questions that are just difficult to deal with. And so they would play games to deal with these questions, to answer them, and to celebrate too. So Dr. Woodbine went on to study religion after playing basketball briefly in college. And he realized many parallels with religion and church specifically, and the basketball court, the way he and his peers used it. People often go to church to solve these big life questions and to get a better sense of meaning in their life and their history. They were doing the same on the basketball court. So what Dr. Woodbine went back and did in Roxbury was he went and talked with youth and did studies and came up with a ritual, a sort of way of applying church and applying your own experiences and your own history to the game of basketball. Now this is done in 8 steps. This is actually designed specifically for the Malcolm X Park in Roxbury. There are 8 steps going from step 1, Africa, you're playing on the court and you're just doing some free throws, symbolic of freedom and from racism and oppression because it's the origin. And then all the way to, say, a dark point in African-American history, lynching, where you're playing one against many. Basically what you're doing is in each of these steps, you're playing a basketball game that's related specifically to a point in African-American history. And the idea is that as you play these physical games, you get a better understanding of that point in African-American history, and you're supposed to reflect on your own experiences in relation to that. So for example, step 3 is Jim Crow laws. And that's a one-on-one basketball game. So you have someone in front of you and you're directly playing against them, but you actually have one hand tied behind your back. And that's symbolic of the oppression and the unjust laws that barred African Americans from participating equally in society at that time. It's actually pretty amazing work. Even the physical slope has meaning in this. There's 4 courts at Malcolm X Park, and they have a slope kind of like this. So you play from the top downward to symbolize the downward progression of African American history in this ritual. And then you play back down upward to symbolize the liberation and the hope that people have gotten through things like the Civil Rights Movement and the Great Migration. And somehow I was supposed to translate all this to the internet. That's a pretty big ask. There's a lot of really beautiful work and thinking in there, and I didn't know at first how to translate it into the internet, but I took a stab at it. I drew up these storyboards. They show the progression, like in the physical space, downward to upward. We use things like color cues and audio, increasing and decreasing, to help give that feel. As far as the actual interactions go, instead of physically playing games, what you have is a prompt. So that prompt is supposed to make you think about your experience in relation to this point in African American history. So, for example, we talked about Jim Crow laws and playing one-on-one basketball. The prompt there is one thing that has held you back. And it's through those prompts that you're supposed to make the connection between your experience, or lack of experience, that's valid too, in these times, and sort of come to a conclusion at the end about what that experience means. So that's the first set of storyboards. This is the second set. You can see it's composed of illustrations, audio notes, and more interactive prompts. So it turned out not to be the biggest challenge to translate this to the internet. The actual prompts in the interactive were pretty easy to write once I thought about it. The biggest challenge turned to be, how do we create a safe space for people to do this reflection online? Dr. Woodbine was absolutely, pleased with this direction, and he was really happy and excited for doing this. But one thing that's critical to this ritual working is that you answer things honestly and truthfully, and you do this reflection, and you really reflect on these sometimes painful prompts. And that's hard to do in a physical space. That's hard to do in a counselor's office. How do we do that on the internet, where there are people like trolls, and there's spam, and there's all kinds of people trying to disrupt the experience? So this turned out to be the biggest challenge. And by the way, the deadline's in a month. Cool. So I tried explaining this to our developers, and I was kind of panicking because I realized how big of an ask it was. And I was like, oh no, we're not going to be able to do this. Unfortunately, we have John DeRogers on our team, which I'm sure some of you will recognize that name. And he stayed calm. He said, hey, have you considered using the WordPress REST API for this? And I was like, wait, what? Really? He's like, yeah, no, hear me out. It turned out to make a lot of sense the more he explained it. So the REST API makes a lot of sense for this project for a couple different reasons. He proposed using a custom comment type, which gives us the ability to moderate these responses. That's an important part of protecting that, that safe space and creating that safe space. And I'll go a little bit more into that as we go through these slides. It ties responses directly to an article, no separate services or databases. So my area of expertise, the way that I work, is generally in HTML, CSS, SAS, and JavaScript. So when I was researching ways to do this, everything that I researched was an external database or API, something that could break in the future. And although these articles seem short-lived, in reality, every once in a while, our public relations department will tweet them out and surface them again, or somebody will come across them in Google. So I have to make these articles in a way that they will be somewhat future-proof. They'll continue working into the future. And by tying these responses to the article and using WordPress, we know that as long as we're using WordPress, definitely the foreseeable future with how many sites we're on Boston University, we're just fine. It separates the normal comments from responses to the prompts. This is an important part of making it a custom comment type. These custom comments don't show up in normal article discussion. So people can freely discuss the article, and no one's response to their trauma or oppression is going to magically show up in the middle of that with no context. We definitely don't want that. So that was something the REST API allowed us to address as well. Finally, it makes responses really easy for me to display as a designer. So while John D. set up the REST API endpoints, and while he put everything together and made it easily accessible to me, he didn't have to do the part where, actually putting it into the front end, and I was able to choose the responses I wanted and put it all in the design as I thought was best. So in practice, that looks a little bit like this. You get some sort of prompt in this ritual. In this case, this is a prompt from the middle passage, and it says, enter a trauma or oppression you've experienced. You would hit keep going. From there, that response is sent to the WordPress admin and the backend, where an editor would review and moderate it and make sure it's in line with the discussion we want to have, and it's in the spirit of Dr. Woodbine's work. You'll notice here circled in red that there's a little Bostonia features. So that's the custom comment type coming in. You can see it's totally different from normal comments. And in fact, you'll see that authors are always anonymous. You don't have to log in or anything for this. We are not interested in who you are. We don't want to know about your specific traumas and oppressions. We just want to gather them as a community response. If comments are approved, they go and they're approved, and John D goes and fetches them for me and puts them in a place where I can get them. You'll notice at the bottom here, there's a set timeout call. He's refreshing these comments every 30 seconds. So if there's 4 different people working on this article and putting in their responses, and 3 of them get done and one's still over here, I want this one person to get those 3 responses, people's responses in their version of the article. So I always have the most up-to-date responses because of the way that he decided to do this. Finally, it gets to me. And so in my JavaScript, I go and I pull in, if this is a particular slide, we're going to grab the responses from 3 different types of prompts that we're getting, struggles, things we can change, and who we are, in order to create a really powerful message at the end and a takeaway for people at the end of the article, which ends up looking like this. You can see all of these responses, all of the typography in the background, those are real responses from people who decided to go through this article. So we had something up and working, which was great, but we needed to have a talk about moderating responses. That was our next big challenge. What's the moderation process look like for this kind of delicate subject matter? So often moderation is left to the robots, things like bad words filters, reCAPTCHA, et cetera. And that's great, robots are helpful, but we can't entirely rely on them here. If you take a look at the middle passage prompt and you looked at enter a trauma or oppression you've experienced, that can be anything from blank, that's a valid answer. You can completely not answer this question, and that's a reflection on your experience. If you haven't had a trauma or oppression, that's something that you've discovered from this process. But it can also have very delicate and sort of important experiences that are painful, like abuse or suicide, which are actual responses that we've gotten to this prompt. And in that vein, if we're just letting the robots look at everything and passing it through a simple bad words filter, we run the risk of erasing those really painful experiences that are important to Dr. Woodbine's work and are important to the discovery that you're supposed to make at the end of this journey. So we decided we couldn't do that. We needed a little bit more of a tailored approach. Basically, human issues need a human moderator. The second thing that we had to address at this point is the best place for reCAPTCHA. Obviously, we don't want these responses being flooded with spam or people selling their hair products. That's not appropriate in this context. So we have to put in some level of protection. But we don't want to do it at the beginning because we're already asking a lot of you in this ritual. We're asking you to do some very difficult inward thinking about your history personally. And putting a reCAPTCHA in front of that, if you've looked at usability studies, you know that that can be a barrier as is. So we definitely didn't want to do that. The second thing that came up is that, even with reCAPTCHA being simplified and it being a simple tap, if you were to put it at the beginning, that's a mental reminder that your answers are going to go public, that you are going to be potentially releasing those answers out to the wider world. And that's not the point of this exercise. The point of this exercise is to be honest with yourself and to think about your own experiences without editing yourself. So we don't want people, sitting here and focusing on self-editing and, the way that they're portraying themselves to the world. We want them to stay focused on deep inward thinking. And for that reason, we ruled out putting reCAPTCHA at the beginning. The final submission and moderation process ended up looking a little bit like this. So you can see we have 5 prompts with actual submissions that you can make, a word that encompasses who you are, a trauma or oppression you've experienced, something that has held you back, a way you or those around you have been suppressed, and one thing that you will change. After you've answered each of those responses, you see them at the end in your own article. And you do this before anybody else sees it. It's actually pretty brilliant. John D. uses local storage to do this. And what you get to see is an actual preview of how your responses interact with the entire community's responses of people who have already answered this. So you get feedback and reassurance that you're not the only one sharing these struggles, and that this is a place that you can be honest. Only after that do we put in reCAPTCHA. You learn exactly what's going to happen with your responses. You see a preview first, and you can choose from there to either leave your mark on the article by submitting the responses and actually change the design for future readers, or you can say, no thanks, this wasn't what I was looking for, I'm not ready to share this with the world. Either one is fine. From there, should you choose to share your responses with the world, all responses do go through a little bit of roboting. They do go through a modified bad words filter, they do the reCAPTCHA check, and they do other checks for things like comment flooding. Each individual response is checked against these. So as long as the response goes past these, they automatically go right to the article so other people can see it immediately. If they don't, say one response triggers the bad words filter, it goes into manual review by an editor. And the hope is that editors will be able to quickly see what the response is, and they have a good sense of what the ritual is like and what the questions are like. As long as your response is in line with the original intent of those questions, it's not going to be trashed or moderated simply for being controversial content. They will approve it and they will let it go through so that that gets shared with the world. So for this project, the REST API gave us easy access to WordPress content for designers who code. That's me. It meant that John D. didn't have to do all of the work on this article, and I was able to build a stronger experience and put in a really strong message at the end based on the community aspect of Dr. Woodbine's work and, together sharing all of our experiences and what that looks like. It also gave us scaffolding for moderating and protecting reader responses, critical to creating that safe space to do intense self-reflection on your experiences and how they line up with the experiences of people and other people in African American history. We also had total control over when and how the responses were submitted and checked. So again, this is important for making sure that we put people in the right mindset to be truthful and to really focus on the ritual as opposed to how they're projecting and how they're showing themselves to the greater internet world. And all of that together gave us the ability to bring people together in this project, which I was super proud of, and I know Dr. Woodbine was really excited about. The second opportunity I had to work with the WordPress REST API was a little more straightforward. It was a course planning prototype for a tool that we're hoping to build in the future. This is actually still in progress for some students who have very complex scheduling needs. So our big challenge here was just to help students plan a schedule with complex requirements. And the complex requirements are things like, they can't register for courses directly. They have to enter a course lottery in order to keep things fair and make sure everybody gets into the very popular classes for that particular program. So we had to give them a way to be able to plan multiple schedules because you don't know how many backup schedules you're going to need. The other big challenge was that connecting to the student information system was out of scope. We couldn't go and ask student information systems anything about a student, including what courses you've already taken, what degree program you've enrolled in, et cetera, which rules out a lot of automatic checking for things like, prerequisites and co-requisites, et cetera. And the UI solve for this is really just to put the onus on them to put the degree requirements in front of them and make it easy to find those degree requirements through very careful filtering, instant searching, and the way that we're asking questions in the UI. So my job in this is to plan and build a prototype. And whenever you want to prototype anything, you start by drawing some circles and squares and arrows and things like that. You start with a user flow. So that looks a little bit like this. If there's people here who haven't worked with user flows before, they're really great for defining the exact actions that somebody's going to take in a tool, and also figuring out the steps and decisions they'll make to get to different points in the tool. So you can see here my main actions are highlighted in green, but what I was really concerned with was building a valid schedule and making sure that people understood if something met their prerequisites or co-requisites or different degree requirements. So you'll see there's a lot of logic here for, meets prerequisites, meets co-requisites. Is it arranged or online? Since a big part of this tool was building a valid schedule, and part of that was scheduling on a calendar, those are questions we have to ask. And again, the UI solve, instead of going and asking student information systems about that student, is to say, here is the class, here's the program, here are the prerequisites, have you taken them? And if not, do you want to take them now? After that, we do some basic wireframing. I went through several rounds of this to come to this, which is starting to look like a tool. You can see some of the basic functionality here, a website header, search by class name or professor, sorts, and various filters for things that we think might be important to students, both on the scheduling aspect for days, times, and semesters, and also on the degree requirements aspect. What's my practice area? What are my learning outcomes? What type of class am I taking? To the right here, you'll see a list of courses, to the left, a list of courses. The right is a scheduler. But what this is lacking is real data, because at this point, we had to figure out, how do we deal with the edge cases before actually getting into building this? We don't know from that wireframe when a filter is going to be useful, because we don't have real data attached to it. We can't see the exact courses that are going to show up if a filter is clicked. And the answer to that is just to build the rest of the prototype, which is a big ask, as it turns out. So I got a little stuck here. At first, I tried to use CuratingCHA to do this. CuratingCHA is the tool that I use for the user flows and wireframing and prototyping. And it's really great at a lot of stuff. It's great at mobile wireframes. It's great at light prototyping. It's not great at data. Once you put in 20, 30 rows, and perhaps this is me being self-taught, not knowing how to use it, but from my experience, after 20 or 30 rows of data and using a repeater so you can actually search and sort and filter, your performance goes way down the tubes. So it all kind of falls apart. And I realized that we have a couple hundred classes that we're actually working with, so CuratingCHA wasn't going to work. Fortunately, around the same time, I attended this talk by John Rea at WP Campus, and it was all about using JavaScript in the WordPress REST API. This may sound obvious to all of you, but I didn't realize you could do this. The WordPress REST API always sounded like this magical faraway thing that wasn't in my language and I didn't have access to. So even as he said the words, "Please don't actually do this, it's a horrible idea," I went home and I did it. Because what I realized is, if I can get WordPress data using JavaScript, I can do anything. And that means that I can build this course prototyping tool and I can use real data. I can use it to build this and actually figure out whether these filters are useful. And also, we happen to know that we were already using the WordPress REST API for this project because we had an existing infrastructure in place that made it easy to do so. So I gave it a try and it worked great. It was like flying. I got the JSON, I looped through it, I printed out all the courses. It was amazing. And it probably wasn't at the level that you guys are doing it at. It was just basic JavaScript. I wasn't working in React or anything yet. I'm not there yet. But it was so great for me because it solved a need that I had. And so what I was able to do was go from this very static wireframe where, yeah, we got a good sense of the labeling and the hierarchy of things, but didn't quite know how things would be used, to this very nice, usable prototype where you could actually do instant search and see immediately what results would come up, where you could filter and you could pick semester and days and times and see, whether those filters really made sense. If there's only 2 results for something, is that a useful filter? We know now. We're going to find out in usability testing, exactly what students are trying to do while they use this prototype, because they can build an actual schedule with it. You can see here that scheduling does work. You're going to see this button clicked here. And you can even see that I've uncovered some UI issues just through doing the slides for this. That schedule, that item on the calendar, when you click it, you don't see it immediately in the calendar view. It doesn't scroll down to it. So that's a UI issue I've uncovered by rapid prototyping. And finally, we get a real good sense of the flow. So after you've added to the schedule and you review your year, does that make sense? Are we presenting students with the right information right away? So the REST API solved a huge problem for me, and it makes a ton of sense for rapid prototyping. Filters and results use real data and are easily updatable. That's big for me because when I go to usability testing and I talk with students and find out that a filter is confusing or not quite right for them, I can change it quickly. It's a simple taxonomy in WordPress. I can say, oh, the name of this is this now. And from there on, right away, I know and I can use that data and adjust the prototype so that we know what to build in the future. There's no restrictions to the amount of data you can use, which means that I get a very realistic view of how a student is going to use a schedule, not just a plain wireframe. There's little to no manual data input. This saves me a ton of time. It takes real time to put data in an Acture. So if I can just get the data from a place it's already in, that's a huge time saver for me. And finally, it just happened to be a good idea, an opportunity to pre-vet front-end libraries before build. So I got to take a look at list.js and fullcalendar.io, and they were fantastic. I actually ended up using them in a couple projects after. So that's all great, but what now? You might be wondering, I'm not a UX designer. I'm not you. I'm a developer. I knew all these things already. What are you going on and on about? That's okay. That's fine. I realize I'm not here to tell you that you should be doing a bunch of rapid prototyping or building, huge interactive editorial experiences tomorrow when you go home. But that's not what this is all about. That's not what the REST API is all about. What it's all about is who you are, because everybody is going to have a different view of what the REST API is and what it can do for them. So when I thought about the REST API years ago, and it meant all this stuff that kind of made sense to me, but also kind of didn't in the terms of my workflow, now it means a whole different set of stuff to me that might not make sense for you, but it sure makes sense for me. Things like getting feedback from students early and often, giving people a safe space to talk about tough issues, testing our assumptions before building, and even trying to get to better tech specs and scope as a result of the feedback that we're getting from students before we go into build. But most importantly, it means that I can talk to WordPress too. And this is true for all of the people that you work with who are willing to learn JavaScript or any language that's easily accessible with JSON. They can talk to WordPress too. And every single one of them is going to have a different perspective on what the WordPress REST API can do for them. So if there's nothing else you take home from this today, I want you to go home and tell your designers, tell your producers, tell your junior developers who are afraid and think this is out of their league and that they're never going to be able to do this, that yes, the REST API is for you. You can talk to it too. That's the beauty of this, and that's powerful. And that's how we will get to innovate and to build new things that are really exciting. Thank you so much.